Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. I hope you've been well, and I hope that while you're listening to this, you are taking some time to look up at the sky, to look at the clouds. I had this really incredible experience recently of feeling a lot of healing just looking at the clouds. Life has been pretty full for me here. And it's been incredible. And also, I would notice myself going on walks in the neighborhood, and then I just realize how much I've been carrying in my head, how much thinking I've done, how much I'm just so focused on life, and everything that life is kind of bringing me. And then I would look up at the skies. I live in Brooklyn, so I would see the skies kind of in between the low-hanging buildings. And then I would just wake up, I would wake up to the fact that the world is such a huge place, the galaxy is huge. And yeah, despite whatever is happening to you at any given moment, there's really so much intelligence in all of this. There's all this life, there's all these processes that are really always unfolding, even when it doesn't feel like it. So yeah, I want to share a little bit about where I've been, because I want to peel back the layers around this course that I'm creating. I've been deep at work, and really what's in front of me is I'm creating a summer course on creativity, but it's so much more than that, right? It's so much deeper. The process itself is so much more interesting than just kind of like, okay, here I am building a course, module number 1, module number 2, And it's this process has been such a profound contemplation about creativity, especially the ways that creativity and art making relates to our healing process, and how it relates to the spiritual path, for those of us who are walking the Spirit's path. I think I've been saying in different podcast episodes about how I've been in this 10-month program, this voice teacher training with Marissa Michelson, and it's been really profound and incredible. And it's also confronted me to look at my stories and my orientation, my postures towards my creativity, and as I'm building skills in walking this path of sharing this vocal de-armoring work with people, I'm also really looking at myself and really looking at these places within myself that has for a very long time been holding back. As a child, the world of spirit, the world of making art, expressing my creative nature, these weren't separate worlds for me. I remember being a child and being so connected to kind of the divine nature of reality. I was always a mystic in that sense. I was always really connected to the ways that the world speaks back to us, right? Like, we don't live in a world that's dead. We live in a world that's so alive, and that flow between, the world outside of us and the world within us, that there's no separation, really, right? Especially when I was a child, the flow was so innate. It was so undeniable. And I think many of us can relate to this. As children, we're not susceptible to the ways that adults put things in boxes, right? We're really in that state of allowing everything is interconnected, everything is interdependent. Children are so intelligent. Children are so in touch with the true nature of reality. And there was so little resistance for, you know, little versions of us, right? So many of us can look back at that time and we can very quickly pinpoint, oh yeah, that's what flow felt like. If we are feeling something intense, we just cry, and then within 5 minutes, we're back to laughing, right? If we feel inspired, we just start moving our hands, and then things started coming out of us. And there was no judgment around, like, is this good or is this bad? And then we grew up, right? We started growing up, and I'm putting like air quotes here around growing up, and we started to have all these ideas, all these thought forms being thrown at us, and they began to calcify in our psyche. I remember very well the first time that somebody rewarded me for my creativity. There was this competition at school during Easter, and we had to make something using eggs. And my mom and I created this really gorgeous project where we turned eggs into mermaids. It's so Piscean. It's perfect. And obviously it was this temporary craft project, right? We were turning eggs into mermaids, and the eggs, went bad a few days later. And I really wish I had photos of it, but this was early 90s in Indonesia, so we weren't taking pictures of every single little thing. And so we worked on it like well into the night, and I remember having so much fun, and at that point it really didn't matter what the outcome was. I remember barely thinking this was a competition. It was just like a thing that I was doing with my mom, and it was so much fun. And we were using these glues. We were cutting up all these like paper, right? And we had all these colors, and we put the kind of plastic eyes right on the eggs, and it was just so much fun. And the next day, I submitted it as we all had to in school, and we came first place. We were first place in the competition, and I remember being so proud of it. It was so extremely satisfying to be recognized as my artist self. And you know what the best thing about that was? I wasn't even it wasn't a belabored thing, right? I was simply applying myself, right? Me and my mom, we were in this flow, and we were just creating, collaborating, and then people recognized it, and it was like this amazing icing on top. But I think what started to happen, even though there was such a positive memory, it was such an incredible experience, was that it calcified in my mind this idea that, oh, I could get rewarded for being in that flow state. And so I think what followed that was this attempt to recreate it, right? This is part of, I think that this is part of being human, but also it's something that is really encouraged for a lot of us as we transition from being children into being adults. We were conditioned to believe that these positive experience, we were supposed to put it on the frame. We were supposed to continue to like recreate it, right? And that insistence on recreating what was simply a beautiful, flowing, amazing mystical experience, right? This experience where we got to be fully ourselves in that creative flow kind of became a trap. It became a trap of its own, and then we tried to find that state over and over again, and then that in and of itself became its own crazy maze, right? And likewise, I remember on the other side of this, I also got into trouble as a child many, many times for being so kind of like in that desire of expressing myself creatively. You know, my parents once bought me this box of crayons and I got so excited and I started to draw all over the insides of my dad's car and he was furious, you know, and looking back at it now, it's like it's funny to me, you know, like who would do that? Who would just draw all over their parents' car? But as a child it was really scary, you know, and similarly, but in a different direction to that experience of winning that competition, right? Um I then grew up trying to avoid that feeling of being confronted, of being faced with the scary part of my parents, you know, or even like my grandparents. I remember with my grandpa, I love his red pen. He has this red pen that he really loved, and I used to love writing with it, you know, and I would sneakily kind of without his permission use the red pen. And one time he found out that I was doing that, and the red pen started to run out of ink because I kept using it. And then my grandpa got really mad at me, and I got so scared, you know, and I didn't want him to be mad at me, but I was also kind of annoyed at him and I wanted to piss him off, you know, and then it became this tug of war, right? And anyhow, what I'm really trying to say here is that we have these experiences as we walk our path as creatives, as artists, and we quickly learn what to do and what not to do, right? That part of growing up as humans, really, but also as an artist in a human body, is that we began to receive messages about what it means to make stuff, what it means to be a creative being. And there's kind of a polarization here, right? Art making or creative expression started to be boxed in as something good and worthy of celebration within certain contexts. And then in other contexts, it is boxed in as something problematic, something that gets us into trouble, right? Later down the road, when I was a teenager, I remember very consciously receiving a lot of messages as a musician that this is the kind of music that's worth making, right? This is the kind of music that's not worth making. I grew up in church, you know, in a very kind of prescriptive, what do you call it, denomination, right? It's a denomination in church that was very prescriptive. It was like, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, you know. And then there was kind of this idea that like this kind of music is glorifying to God and this kind of music is trash, right? And it's kind of funny to me now thinking about it, because I'm like, well, music is just frequency, you know. It's just really, if you look at it from the perspective of like Western music theory, music is just 12 notes, you know, like who cares, you know, how could you create any kind of judgment about what music is good or not, you know, which music is worthy or not. But I think we really walk through the world getting a lot of these messages, you know. And of course, for those of you who are very meta in your thinking, you quickly can draw the parallel, right? That what happens to us as creative beings, what happens to us walking this creative path, is really the conditioning that many of us humans receive in terms of relating to life, right? Like this expression of human being, right? Like literally humans being on this earth. These expressions are okay, these expressions are not okay, right? So these boxes, they create subliminal messages. They create a kind of invisible container within which we create. Now, if you're a writer, your craft includes pouring words into an empty page, right? But if you're really honest, those pages are not empty, are they? Those pages, when you're staring at them, they're actually filled with all these invisible rules. Invisible rules about like, this is what you can write and this is what you can't write. This is the kind of writing that will get you in trouble, and this is the kind of writing that will get you praise and validation. What you're looking at is not an empty page. You're looking at this invisible composite. You're looking at this wall of messages that you've received around this is what works, this is what doesn't. And the same thing goes with musicians, with painters, with dancers, with actors, right? Regardless of your medium, you find yourself going to the blank canvas, so to speak, but it's never really blank, right? It's always filled with some sort of invisible guidelines that begin to dictate what you create and how you create. And so, this course I'm creating is really a distillation of my contemplation around why it is that for some of us it's really hard to claim the identity of an artist, which then leads to a kind of hardship in really throwing ourselves at our creative practice, right? Which, if you are born into the archetype of an artist, you know that you must make art. Like, you don't really have a choice, you know. I mean, I wish we do, but we really don't. You know, I know all of my life I have been making art. I don't have a choice. But because I have these fraught relationships to making art, the act of creating then gets colored, right, by these experiences that make it feel hard, you know, or sometimes make it feel like almost inflated. You know, like I get kind of high on my own supply of the fantasy pictures of what it means to make art, and then I use that fantasy as energy that helps me get to the finish line of the creation process. But then afterwards, when I share it with people, I realized, because I was so deep in my own story about what it means to be an artist and putting it on a pedestal, that I wasn't able to create the kind of connection that I wanted to with people. I wasn't actually able to create this heart-centered conversation that I really want to, that I was really craving for, because to me personally, the heart of creative work is connection. It's not that I just want to express myself and then leave it at that, right? I want to create something that means something for other people. I want other people to feel like they can be seen, that they can be reflected through me, kind of letting myself come to the altar of creativity, right? That I allow myself to be exactly who I am, that then gives permission for other people to be exactly who they are. You know, and in that flow of all of us just kind of being true to ourselves, not putting up all these defenses, not creating all these masks, not trying to manipulate life, paradoxically, we get to the heart of life, right? It's so euphoric in the most amazing way possible. You know, it's really union with the divine, right? And at that point, this question of like, are we grounded or are we spiritually bypassing? Like, none of those questions are even relevant anymore, you know, because you're just at the heart of life. You're just like in the flow, right? You know, as soon as I knew how to doodle when I was very young, maybe I was 3 years old, I was doodling profusely. I remember being 3 years old and doodling profusely, right? So very likely I started doing this when I was maybe 2 or 1.5, you know, but even though I have been a creative all my life, my relationship with that creative force is one of the most fraught places in my life. It's the one area that brings up the most fear, the most anxiety, the most kind of intense desire to be seen in a very specific way, which all of that leads to heartbreak, deep, deep heartbreak for me. You know, and so this is really in the last, I don't know, 36 years of my life, right? This is the place where I've had to do the most amount of transmutation, the most amount of alchemy. I got into spiritual work because I was so creatively devastated. I was so creatively blocked, you know, and I had to kind of walk myself back and figure out what happened here. Why is it that the thing I love the most is causing so much suffering and so much pain? And I you know, I don't think that this course is exclusively for tortured artists like me, you know? But I do think that for many people, certainly many of you listening here that I've spoken to, that there's traces of this tortured artist archetype, right? And there's the sense that somehow, for whatever reasons that are specific to you and your lived experience, your upbringing, your ancestral patterns and stories, right? You weren't allowed to make art. You weren't allowed to express yourself in a way that feels honest, satisfying, multidimensional. You weren't allowed to be exactly who you are in this moment, and instead you have to curate this version of yourself, and this course is really a kind of scaffolding that I'm providing. This is a kind of hand-holding structure and resource that I'm creating to assist those of you who are interested in discovering your creative self, rediscovering your artist self, so you can walk through the dark woods of beginning to make something again. This is a course that is for people who have been creatives all their life, like me, but this is also a course for those who have been too scared to step into the flame of the creative vision. It's really a course that doesn't care about your level of expertise, your mastery in your craft. It doesn't matter your entry point. You could be such a beginner, you could be so, engaged for decades in a creative practice. It doesn't matter what your medium is. You could be a writer, you could be a musician, a dancer, a painter, you could be a sculptor, you could be a cook, you could be doing anything that is remotely artistic. You could be an entrepreneur, because to me that's also very artistic, right? Especially the way that we're doing it in our modern day existence. For many of us, we have to wear multiple hats. We have to do our own marketing. We have to do our own, kind of bookkeeping, right? And we want to infuse artistry and creativity in all areas of our lives. And in fact, one of the modules that we're going to be moving through is defining for yourself what is at the heart of creativity for you, and then specifying what it means for you to make art, for you as an individual to make art. Because I truly believe that at the heart of creativity, at the heart of living a creative life, the core of it is really, really simple. It's all about paying attention. And in order to pay attention, you must be present to whatever is in the way of you paying attention, whatever is blocking you from actually looking at life, whatever is blocking you from actually allowing the natural expression of your life force, right? And truly, that skill of being able to look at all these deterrents, all these obstacles, all these invisible lines on that empty page, right? That skill is a skill that mystics have been training for a long time, right? If you've been engaged in any kind of mystical practice, that's really what's at the core of it. When the mystics ground themselves and begin to clear all of these preconceived notions about the divine, they're actually preparing their vessel so they can receive wisdom. They can be in that state of union with the divine. And that's the exact same state that one needs in order to practice making art. Because inevitably, when you're in that state of having cleared enough of the preconceived notions, you arrive at a state of both emptiness and fullness. You're empty of your own expectations, and therefore you can be full of your own essence. And so the divine can move through you. There's no choice but to express yourself creatively through art. You stop being in the state of thinking about making art, fantasizing about being an artist, and you get yourself to that place where you're actually making, right? Because your true nature is to be creative. So if this sounds like an exciting exploration, if this sounds like an exciting course, an exciting, just kind of way of being this summer, I invite you to join our waitlist. So this waitlist, people who are on the waitlist are going to be the only ones who receive early bird discounts for this specific round of the program. And so early bird is enrollment is going to be open at the end of this week. And so, I invite you to check it out and be part of the waitlist if you want that, if the early bird rate matters to you. And, a question that I get a lot from folks who are interested in this course is, what's the format here? And I'll talk about this more specifically next week when we kind of dive more deeply into the mechanics of what I'm walking people through with creative exorcism. But for now, and that's the name of the course, Creative Exorcism. And I'll talk about it later. I'll talk about why in a second about why I call it that, because there's a cool story behind it. But this course is about 95% independent study. And I'm designing this course very specifically and very intentionally so that it can be self-study for you. And at the same time, we're going to be moving through a kind of daily practice, right? So you'll be receiving daily prompts for the first 20 days, and then the next 40 days, it's a 60-day practice. The next 40 days, the second half, you'll be receiving longer form teachings from me that can support you in your process of kind of more deeply looking at your creative process. But the focus in the next 40 days is really for you to be in kind of a daily creative process. And that can bring something up for us, right? That's kind of confronting to come to something daily. I have been since the beginning of this year in a daily practice of ritual, of really coming to my altar every day and working, doing kind of spirit work. And there's something confronting about like every day you wake up and doing that, and I hear from a lot of creatives like, I can't be consistent, and things like that. And I think I see that, but also I think that the reason why people really struggle with consistency, I'm just going to say it straight up, before we even get into the course, is because people have ideas about what consistency is supposed to look like. But, consistency is about like showing up and sometimes not being able to do so. Sometimes failing, and then kind of getting back up and doing it again. And I think having a light, getting yourself to a place where you're empty of these expectations so you can continue to just get yourself back up, and there's like zero violence in being consistent, is I think like the point of it. You don't have to be violent to yourself. You can just kind of affirm to yourself like, yeah, this is something that matters to me, and my job isn't to make anything that's even remotely good. I just have to get there, So anyways, the reason why I choose this format is very intentional. One, I'm well aware many of us are traveling and have kind of family or, chosen family obligations during the summer. So it's very important that we can fold this exploration of the creative self into our daily lives, right? So that's why I want it to be mostly kind of independent study. And two, I believe that this work is ultimately about meeting yourself. I'm a huge fan of receiving kind of communal support, right? All of us coming together, doing the work together. And what I found is for a lot of creative types, it's important to be very mindful of how much of that we do, because being in kind of that communal space, ultimately, I think where we're at collectively is we're still relating from a space of sameness for a lot of us. We want to see ourselves reflected back to us. And I think there's something beautiful about that. And also when we consistently do that, comparison comes up. And yes, comparison is something that we can work with, we can clear, right? But I think at the stage of, especially people who want to start feeling themselves in that creative momentum, comparison is not very helpful. So while consistent access to community can provide a kind of support, it can also distract you from the work. It can also distract you from continuing to return to yourself, returning to your own rhythm. So the process here is designed so you can look at yourself, look at your own process, and you can cultivate an orientation of marveling at whatever is coming up. So for those of you who are listening to the podcast, I think you're really going to enjoy this course. You're really going to love this course because you're really already interacting with my frequency in that way. You're listening to this podcast. There's no kind of air quotes accountability here. You're already in your own space. You're already receiving from these transmissions. And so the course itself will almost be like this private podcast for all of us who are in this container, and I want to speak about the title because the title Creative Exorcism is so juicy, first of all, I think. And I think many of you can really already feel the evocative nature of this title, right? This provocative nature of what I'm inviting us into. And the inspiration behind it is I had this dream about this haunted house. I was walking around this haunted house and, the woods, the floors are creaking, right? And all that. It's like the typical haunted house. And in each room that I was in, there was a ghost that has something negative to say about my creative process, about me as an artist, right? And there was one room that says something along the lines of, "What's the point of doing this? Nobody cares about what you make. It's not going to make money. You should stop doing this. You should be an adult. You should do the thing that can get you all these things. Like, stop being so stupid," basically, right? There was another room where it was this young part of me like sobbing in a corner, feeling like my parents don't understand what I'm creating. They're not supporting me. My teachers aren't seeing me, right? My peers are making fun of me for doing this. And if I express myself truthfully, nobody would get it and I would feel even more alone, right? And it's just like turning away, And then I went to another room and there was a voice that literally just said, "Never mind," And then whenever I kind of start to come close to it, it says, "Never mind," and it's just kind of pushing me away. So I thought, I realized somewhere in this dream that was unfolding that these voices, they're not really mine, In other words, I realized they're not part of my authentic energy. This isn't part of like my myself, really. They were kind of conditioned patterns that have been calcified into what seemed like a person, what seemed like a character inside of me. And so in this dream, I started to do a ritual to release these spirits, and I woke up and then this phrase, creative exorcism, like flashed in my mind, and I was like, whoa, that's really cool. So yeah, I invite you to join the waitlist. If that's interesting to you, you'll be hearing more from us with details about the course. And yeah, later this week, enrollment is gonna open up and I'll be back next week and we'll talk more about this. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your time, for your energy. And until we gather again, I'm just, sending you so much love. And for those of you who also are having any creative projects where, doesn't matter, right? Where maybe that's like something you're doing around the house, something you're doing with the kids, something you're doing for yourself or you're doing with your partner. I hope that all of that is, just giving you so much satisfaction and joy. And yeah, if this offering sounds exciting, I hope that you consider being part of it. Okay. Peace, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.